Right now, it's 2 degrees above.
Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And if you think 2 above is bad, we've got Dr. Gary Ostrower on the line, and pretty cold in Allegheny County as he drove through it this morning.
Well, I left at around 7 o'clock heading over to Wlea, and it was 11 degrees below in Alfred, 13 below when I got to Belmont, and it remained pretty much 13 below until I got to Olean, and then once again it just kind of the temperature rose to only 11 below. But hey, we should be pretty grateful. We've gotten off easy this winter, so a few cold days, I suppose, shouldn't deter the tough folks here in the southern tier.
Dr. Ostrower, good to have you on the line this morning. What do we want to talk about today?
Well, you know, President Trump was inaugurated on January 20th of 2017. It is now January 22nd of 2019, so, you know, we have about 2 years to evaluate him. That could be half of his presidency, or it might be 1/4 of his presidency in the event that he wins a second term. You know, historians are going to be, and are already, you know, more or less evaluating him. And historians love to rate their presidents, you know, so President George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt still remain at the very, very top of the charts for those historical surveys by professional historians. And I'm afraid that President Trump at this point, early to say it, but at this point he's kind of at the bottom of that whole thing. And so we might take a look at what he has done right, what he has not done right, but to, you know, offer a kind of historical assessment of where he is at this point.
Sure thing. Do you want to go ahead with that now, or do you want to talk about the Giuliani situation first?
Well, Giuliani is the president's lawyer. I mean, maybe that says something about Trump, because one of the criteria that historians often use in evaluating presidents is the quality of their appointments. And while Giuliani may have been America's mayor way back in 2001, at this point he seems very, very unstable. He changes his mind, perhaps in some ways reflecting the president's own change of mind. But, you know, Giuliani, who at one point said there has been no collusion whatsoever, then he changed to, well, you know, maybe there's been collusion, but collusion is not a crime. Now the Giuliani is saying that, well, yeah, there may have been collusion, but it didn't extend to the president himself. He further said, I think, if I'm not mistaken, just 2 days ago on Meet the Press, when he was interviewed, he made the point that the president was involved in some business dealings with the Russians that extended right until Election Day in 2016. Now he's trying to back away from that. You never know what he's going to say, and you know it really undermines not only the credibility of the president, but it undermines his own credibility. I think that the president may have second thoughts about having asked Mr. Giuliani to remain. On the other hand, the two of them are close. My understanding, and this may be wrong, but my understanding is that they speak almost every day. And so one might suspect that, yeah, Giuliani is reflecting the president's state of mind.
I'm guessing that Ivanka, Don Jr., whoever the close circle of advisors are maybe telling the president you might want to rethink having Giuliani as your attorney.
Well, I don't know what the president is thinking, and I think most of us don't. And you know, yeah, he's very, very difficult to predict. But let me go back, if I may, to the issue of a presidential assessment.
Yeah, go ahead.
The president became president. That is to say, Trump became president by kind of challenging a lot of traditional notions of what a president should be or what a president should say. And I think that many people felt, that is to say, those who supported him. Now, granted, let's remember that he was not a popular president in the sense that 3 million, really 2.9 million people more than voted for Hillary Clinton more than they voted for Trump. In other words, he lost the popular vote. but he got the popular vote where it counted. And that meant in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, so that, respecting the Electoral College, he did indeed become president. All right. To what extent, in other words, has he fulfilled the promises? And to a certain extent, he has. He said, for instance, that he wanted to build a wall. He still wants to build a wall, although he hasn't been able to do so. He said that he would terminate the Iran treaty, the Iran nuclear treaty. He did that. He said that he would shift the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. He did that. He said that he would cut taxes. He did that. Now, granted, the tax cut that was passed by Congress with his approval and his signature, 83% of that tax cut went to the wealthiest Americans. Is that a good thing? Well, if you're a wealthy American, the answer is you bet it is. If you're not a wealthy American, you're not benefiting from that tax cut. Certainly the Supreme Court was very important in respect to his election. He nominated Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and Brett Kavanaugh was eventually elevated to the court. So I think that one has to give the president a certain amount of credit, at least on these issues, vis-a-vis, his campaign promises. I think there's another very important element in which he said he would do something, and he has. And that has to do with taxes, really tariffs, we would call them, on Chinese imports. Now, here again, is that a good thing? From the president's perspective, yes. From the Chinese perspective, no. From the American perspective, generally, the jury remains out because the international economy is weakening. I might add, by the way, that the Chinese announced just this weekend, that they had the slowest economic growth in China since 2000 or since 2001. In other words, in about 18 or 19 years, maybe even longer than that. And that's worrisome because as the Chinese economy goes, as the American economy goes, so the global economy goes. So that if we slide into a recession or even a depression in the next few years, the president's tariffs, the tariff war that we have with China, is certainly going to play a role. And I think there's one other area where the president said he would do something, and indeed he has. He called NAFTA one of the worst economic agreements ever made. Well, NAFTA is now, in a sense, history. But on the other hand, the agreement that the president came up with Mexico and also with Canada is essentially a new version of NAFTA. It's a somewhat updated version. It provides some additional advantages to the United States, but it's not dramatically different than what we had before. But the point, I guess, that I'm making is that in a number of areas, the president made certain promises, and he has fulfilled some of those promises, if not all of them. On the other hand, historians, I think, are going to be taken by a number of features of the administration that are somewhat less attractive, not the least of which is the president's dishonesty. We have never had, not in 230 years of American presidential history, have we had a president who has come close to President Trump in respect to dishonesty. The Washington Post, which he continues to argue is part of the fake news media, but in fact is a very, very credible institution and a very believable institution, has counted over 8,000 different lies or different misleading statements that the president has made. We've never seen this kind of thing before. When the president makes a statement, most of us don't know whether it's true or whether it's not true. One would have to assume it's probably not true until proven true. And I'm not talking about little things such as the fact that he claimed that his inaugural crowd was the largest in history. I'm not talking about things where he has said, for instance, that his administration has experienced greater economic growth than any presidential administration in American history. These things are simply not true. But in many, many other areas, he's made comments which undermine his own credibility and undermine the credibility of its administration, not only in the eyes of the American public, but also in international eyes, so that the ability or the willingness of other countries to cooperate with the United States in some very, very important ventures internationally is now compromised. So let me just kind of halt there, but I have a number of other things that I would mention also, which is going to have to affect the balance, so to speak, the judgment that historians are going to offer. But you may have some comments and you may have some questions of your own in respect to what I've been saying.
You know, listening to what you've been saying about President Trump there, Dr. Ostrower, I've been wondering, did Trump also contribute to the end, and I'm just wondering if you think this, the end of the moderate Republicans or even the moderate Democrats? You know, before Trump came along, I don't remember so many politicians like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and it seems that he's moved the conservatives more to the right and the left more to the left. Do you think that's true?
Oh, I think it's unquestionably true. But I would also note that Trump didn't begin this. I mean, I think that, until 1994, you had liberal Republicans, you had moderate Republicans, you had conservative Republicans. And what happened when Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1994 in a very, very hotly contested election, that began to break down. Many of the Democrats who lost the election in 1994 when the Republicans took over the House of Representatives, many of the Democrats who lost were moderate Democrats. And so you had left a somewhat more liberal Democratic Party. And by the same token, many of the Republicans were now followers of Newt Gingrich, who was much, much more kind of explosive, much more accusatory, and certainly much more conservative than had been true before. And so, in a sense, 1994, from my perspective, is the period at which we begin to really polarize the two parties. The Republican Party today is Trump's party. At least it is in Congress. You see this especially in the Senate, and to a certain extent you see it in the House of Representatives. Congressmen like Tom Reed, who have been promoting bipartisan efforts, they are really they're in the minority. Most congressmen on the Republican side are not willing in any way, in any substantial way, in any important way, to challenge the president. And on the same token, the Democrats are certainly somewhat more leftist than they were just a few years ago. Even Nancy Pelosi, who in many ways is kind of a moderate liberal, has to take account of the fact that the Democratic Party today is somewhat more leftist than it was just a couple of years ago. So this is not a good thing. I mean, I think that our politics is becoming more tribalized. We're speaking less to each other than we had been before. I think that cable news certainly has a role to play in all of this, in the sense that people are no longer tuning in to CBS or ABC, to moderate, kind of centrist sorts of news programs, but they're tuning into Fox or they're tuning into MSNBC, which pretty much tell people on the left or people on the right what they want to hear.
And I wanted to get back to this part of the question, Dr. Ostrower. For years, conservatives complained about what they called country club Republicans or Rockefeller Republicans. Do you think the Trump presidency has ended the power of old families like, the Bushes? Or do you think that there will be a comeback for that kind of Republican?
Well, do I think there'll be a comeback? Does history repeat itself? Yeah, there probably will be a comeback, but it's not going to be soon. I mean, Trump has really redefined the conservative movement in America. I mean, it's kind of weird, all right? Weird in the sense that here you have a president who, I said a few minutes ago, has lied 8,000 times. When I say lied or misleading statements, 8,000 times. How can a political party that takes itself seriously, how can a political party that takes integrity seriously continue to support someone like this? And yet the fact of the matter is that the Republicans do. We all know about Trump's sexual history. We know about the degree to which he is a sexual aggressor. And he's bragged about it, certainly, when he was running for president. So, the question then becomes, how can evangelicals, 80% of whom continue to support Trump, how can they support a man like this? And so what's happening, I think, is that, we're drawing a line, a rather sharp line, between public morality on one hand and private morality on the other. Evangelicals may take private morality very, very seriously, but in the public sphere, they are still willing, in general, to accept Trump.
Dr. Ostrower, late on getting to the break. I tell you what, we'll skip the commercial. If you don't mind, I'll go right now to meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Rob, it is so cold this morning. What is it, 2 above 0 in Hornell?
Oh, you think you have it bad. How about 12 below in Elmira this morning, 21 below in Watertown, 27 below this morning in Ogdensburg and Saranac Lake. And Brian, that's not the wind chill. That's the air temperature at those locations. Very, very cold across the state this morning. But the good news is cold air is moving out. Milder weather is going to move in. We're going to kind of see some wild conditions develop over the next 24 to 48 hours as the northern branch of the jet stream battles it out with the southern branch of the jet stream. We'll see some sunshine this morning. That'll start to bring the temperatures up. Clouds will increase through the afternoon. We're 25 to 30 later today. Sunrise this morning, 7:32. Sunset tonight at 5:12. Tonight, cloudy skies, breezy. If you're out late, be careful. Some sleet and freezing rain will develop. Lows will be 20 to 25. Temperatures will rise overnight. Tomorrow morning, it looks like a mess. We'll have sleet and freezing rain. Changing to rain. We're breezy. We're milder tomorrow, up to 40 to 45. Colder weather starts to move back in tomorrow night. Rain will change to snow. Lows will be 30 to 35. And Brian will have clouds, scattered snow showers, and seasonable cold Thursday, 35. Looks a little colder than that for Friday.
Thanks, Rob. Back now to Dr. Gary Ostrower, and I want to get to this day in history, but want to let the Dr. Ostrower finish up if he had anything else to say about President Trump.
Well, I think the historians are going to focus on things like his connection with Russia. The New York Times reported a few days ago, and no one is questioning this at this point except for some people in the administration, that the FBI had launched an investigation into the possibility that President Trump was a Russian asset. Now, that's not to call him a Russian agent. It's not to call him a Russian spy, but someone who, to one extent or another, either implicitly or explicitly, is aiding Russian foreign policy. That's serious stuff. Is there evidence for this? The answer is you bet there's evidence for this. His firing of James Comey for looking into the Russian connection, I think, is an example of that. Trump's comments about NATO. He has undermined NATO. He has undermined NATO from the day that he became president. Remember, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, more than any other single organization, has helped to stabilize the world. One of the things I have occasionally said on this program, and I'll say it again, the most important thing from my perspective, the most important single historical development has been not what has happened, but what has not happened. We have not had another general war since 1945, and NATO has a lot to do with the fact that we have not had that war. And yet the president seeks to undermine NATO. President Putin in Russia, if he has one main goal, it's to destroy NATO, is to undermine NATO. And President Trump has certainly aided him in that sense. Trump has not in any way challenged the Russians in respect to their war in Ukraine, their taking over of the Crimea and so forth. In many, many ways, the president has essentially backed up Russian foreign policy, even in the face of comment, not just comment, but conclusions by our own intelligence community, by 17 different intelligence organizations in the United States, that the Russians, for instance, sought to undermine the results of the election, not to undermine the results of the election, but to influence the result of the election in 2016. So what I'm saying, in other words, is that there are some very, very important areas where the president, I think, is going to have to answer to historians and is going to have a hard time to do that. The fact of the matter is that the president has obstructed justice, and I think that his firing of Comey is an example of that. He's undermined checks and balances with his attacks on judges over the course of the last few years. The president's erratic behavior, I think, is certainly a problem. The degree to which there has been more turnover in the present administration than there has been in any other presidential administration in American history, at least within the first 2 years, is a problem. He's taken his A-team, people like Kelly, who's now gone, General Mattis, who's now gone, General McMaster, who's now gone, Gary Cohn, his economic advisor, who's now gone. He's taken top-notch people, and they're now gone, and he's replaced them with the B-team, or maybe the C-team. So I think that all of these things are going to one extent or another play into the judgment that historians are going to make about this president.
Dr. Ostrower, on this day in history, it was January 22nd, 1905. The History Channel says that in Russia, revolution begins when the Tsar's troops, Nicholas II's troops, opened fire on a group of workers who were marching to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to petition Tsar Nicholas II about some complaints. Some 500 protesters were massacred on what they call Bloody Sunday.
Well, welcome to the 20th century. What happens in 1905 is going to be reflective of what's going to happen in 1917, and that was the undermining of the authority of the Tsar. In 1905, it wasn't the Soviet Union yet, the Russians were involved in a war with Japan. And it was really a war for influence in the Far East. No one took the Japanese very seriously. Everyone assumed that a European power, namely Russia, would easily defeat Japan. Well, that's not exactly what happened. And so the Russian economy was increasingly stressed. Prices were up. Whatever kind of, how shall I put it? I don't want to use the term freedom, but opportunities were open to, members of the working class, had certainly been, further circumscribed in Russia during that period, and that led to the demonstrations against the Tsar. In many ways, for 100 years, 200 years, when the Russian working class, to the extent that it existed, certainly a large agricultural class, had complaints, they assumed that the Tsar was on their side and that it was bureaucrats to one extent or another who were compromising their lives. Well, by 1905, that was no longer the case. The demonstrations in 1905 were very much demonstrations against the Tsarist regime. And when the Tsarist regime put down the working class by, simply massacring, as you said, about 500 people, it further undermined the confidence that they had. When Russia went into the First World War in 1914, they went in as, in many ways, a non-industrial country. The Germans made mincemeat of them. By 1917, the revolution broke out. By 1918, the Russians had to sign a peace treaty with the Germans that gave the Germans about one-third of the population of Russia, about one-third of the industrial potential of Russia. They just carved this territory away from Russia. And it was a devastating time for the Russians. But all of it helped to undermine, the old regime. And by 1918, of course, the Tsar was gone. The new, communist government remained in power from November of 1917 until 1989 or 1991, depending on which date you want to use.
And the other big thing on this day in history was Supreme Court legalized abortion with Roe v. Wade down to about 60 seconds. Dr. Ostrower, do you see Roe v. Wade ever getting overturned if Republicans stay in power in the White House?
No, I don't see it getting overturned. I mean, it's possible that it will be overturned, except that, remember, Roe v. Wade was a Supreme Court decision. If you want to overturn the Supreme Court decision, you might have to do it by means of a constitutional amendment. On the other hand, individual states certainly can make law which undermines or limits or whatever Roe v. Wade, and that has happened in a number of states, placing waiting periods before a person gets an abortion, limiting the period during which they can get an abortion. So, for instance, you might have a legal abortion up to month 5, but not between months 5 and months 9, and so forth. Putting restrictions on who can provide those abortions, and so forth. And much of that has already happened in a number of states, including Texas. So, will that happen? It's already happening. What you might have, if there should be a constitutional amendment which eventually abridges Roe v. Wade, is that legal abortion would disappear in the United States, and you go back to a situation such as you had before 1972 or 1973. By the same token, what you may also have, and I think it was much more likely, is that individual states are going to come out in very, very different kinds of positions in respect to the constitutional right to abortion. So you may have it protected in states like New York, and you may have it protected in states like California. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, Governor Cuomo right here in New York is asking this very week for additional New York constitutional protections.
He'll do it tonight, and I'm sorry, Dr. Ostrower, but with that, we've got to go. Always great having you on. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.